How's it going, guys? In this tutorial, we're going to be creating this animated loop in geometry nodes. Now, there's a lot of really cool components that are going to go into making it, all driven through proximity of that sphere that's going around in the loop. So we're going to be creating a proximity system. I'm going to show you some problem solving things about getting objects to sort of point outward on a spherical object. There's a lot of really cool, interesting tricks that you can apply to a lot of different animations. Now, if you recognize this animation, that's because it's lesson number 14 in my new geometry nodes course. So I wanted to release a free lesson for you guys, which means there may be some context in this tutorial that is missing. The way the course is structured is the first half of the course is teaching you a lot of practical ways to recreate different systems in geometry nodes to create interesting things. Then we apply everything we learned to practical, interesting lessons, and this tutorial is one of those practical lessons. So if there is at any point, it may seem like I skipped over saying something, that's because it was addressed much earlier in the course. So if you do want to check out the course, it is right now half off for my Black Friday sale, so you can check it out, linked in the description, along with all of my other products are half off for the rest of the month. With that being said, I'm blabbering, so let's get into this lesson. But we are going to be utilizing a lot of the different things we learned in the first lessons. So let's do it. So the first thing we need to do is build some geometry outside of geometry nodes, because that sort of flat looking model that you saw in the animation isn't something that I know how to build in geometry nodes. So we're going to build it outside of geometry nodes, and we also have to bevel it, so we might as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get a cube. I'm going to go and bring it down to about however big you want it to be. Basically figure out your thickness and then figure out the height of your object as well. I think something like this is going to look really good. I'm going to hit Control A, apply that scale, and then we're going to go into edit mode and just hold down Shift and select each one of these corners like that, and we can hit the bevel tool and give it a perfectly round bevel. And then I'm using my scroll wheel to add subdivision in the bevel. That looks good. And then all we need to do now is add a bevel modifier and make the sides perfectly round. This is very, very round model. Just like that. All right, cool. Now the last thing we need to do is be mindful of the anchor point. When we're instancing things, they are going to be anchored based on where the anchor point is located. And so in this case, I want the edges to be instanced in a spiral, so we don't want that to be in the middle. So I'm going to hit Tab, I'm going to hit A, and then go here to the Move tool and just bring my anchor point to the very bottom of my model. And so that's what kind of makes these practical lessons very important, is we are having to think about things even outside of geometry nodes sometimes before we pull them in. So now that we're done with him, I'm going to call him paddle. Kind of looks like a paddle. And now we can start working in geometry nodes. So we'll hit the plane right here, head into geometry nodes, and I'm going to get a new scene. And let's go ahead and get a curve circle. So curve circle, and then we can plug him right there. So now we have him. Now we need to go ahead and instance all of our paddles around. So we can get a instance on points. And remember, right now, once we instance, we're going to have 32 instances available to us. So keep that in mind of when we're doing things, how many points are available to have instances on them. And then we're going to drag the paddle right into here from the outliner and plug your geometry into instance. So now we have that. If we bring our scale down, you can see, all right, we have our objects. But remember, when it comes to round objects and having them all point outward or inward from the direction of that round object, we need information about the normal. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to get them to rotate the way we want. So that is a particular node called align rotation to vector. So kind of just a memorization thing here, but this isn't going to do what we need it to do, because if we plug rotation into rotation, nothing's going to happen. It still is behaving the same way. That's because it's not able to read our normal yet. We need our normal information plugged into the vector, because this is the vector essentially that it's reading. And then you can choose, I think Y is what we need to choose. Yeah. Okay, so now we have these pointed out correctly, but I need to rotate them for them to look nice, because right now they're intersecting. They need to be rotated this way. Of course, now we don't have access to our rotation settings, so we need to get a rotate instances node. That's going to give us a brand new set of rotation settings, and then we can just rotate it on the Y, just like this. So now we have our object. Now for just some style stuff, I do want to bring my radius in. I think that makes it look better. So now we have this set and ready to go. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do with your rotations. But this to me is the cool one. So now that we have this, we are pretty much ready for the modeling and the shading. Well, not the modeling, sorry, the animation and the shading. We can get that going. We are pretty much done with the modeling portion of things. So there are two things that I want to animate when the object is close to them. I want the objects to scale up a little bit, and I also want them to rotate a little bit as well. Those two things I think will make this very interesting and dynamic. And so in terms of animation, that's what we need to get animated next. So let's set up a few things on my plane here. I'm just going to hit H, just get them out of the way. We need to set up the objects that are going to create the proximity effect. And so I'm going to get an icosphere as the visual object that is holding it. And we need something to allow us to rotate that sphere in a circle. And so what I'll do is I'll get a circle curve, and then we'll click on this object and we'll go to our constraints. Now, when it comes to these practical lessons, the emphasis is still on geometry nodes. When it comes to stuff like this and we're using constraints, there's a little bit of knowledge, I am assuming. There's not going to be a whole lot of this. Still, these practical lessons are going to be primarily like 80-90% all geometry nodes. So I know I'm throwing these constraints at you if you've never used constraints. That's very much another topic. I have a course that will teach you motion graphics sort of in the general topic, and I approached that there. But this is a relatively simple concept. We're not going to dwell on it. But you can click on your icosphere, go to your constraints, and get a follow path and select that path. So now he will be going in a circle. Now, what I'm going to do here is I have him. I am going to go ahead. I'm going to hit the period key and subdivide him really quick. I want him to be perfectly round. And then set shade smooth. I'm actually not going to use him exactly as the object that's going to be recognized. He's just the visual one. What I'm going to do is get an empty and do the same thing. Add a follow path node and select the path. And now we have this empty here. What I typically like to do is use the empty as the thing in geometry nodes that is controlling the proximity, and then separate to that, the object being like this visual cue. And I'll show you why that's useful. But I like to have a visual object that is like in the render, oh, that thing is, the context of that thing is near the other thing and it makes his movement. But really it's the empty that's controlling that, not him. He's just there. Okay. So let's bring our geometry node system back. We'll click on the Bezier circle and bring him up, scale him. I'm hit the tilde key and go to the top just to see where I want my sphere to be. So something like that. And then just bring it close enough, but the sphere doesn't touch. So as close as possible. All right. Now we are ready to get this proximity system working. We've set this up. And then when it comes to the animation, we'll just animate both of them in a circle, the empty and the icosphere. So let's go ahead and just animate the scaling. So let's do a scale instances node that is going to give us an independent node to plug in our proximity nodes into. So if you remember the proximity lesson, we need to go here to the outliner and grab our empty to start the string of nodes that will create a proximity. He is going to control this next node that we're going to pull in. So it's going to be a mesh line. And very, very important, bring your count to 1. We're essentially just creating a single little point, a single little dot that is recognized, that is being recognized as the geometry that is initiating the proximity. This object info, which is representing the empty, when the empty moves, this little mesh line is going to move. And so he's kind of parented in a way. And so that's how this is already starting. So we need to use the location into the start location. And so now these two are married together. We now need to get a geometry proximity node, and we need to set that to points. And then we'll plug mesh into geometry. And then we'll just plug this right into scale. Now we can see that it's working. If it does that, and then when I click on the empty and we move it around, we can see, okay, sweet, it's working. But we need to get a map range to dial this in. So we'll go ahead and Shift A and search and get a map range. And I already know from experience, bring the 2 minimum to 1 and the maximum to 0, or just bring one of them down. And then now we can play with the 2 max, from max. See that? That's how we know it's working. And then you can use the from minimum as well. That one, they both kind of do similar tasks in this example. We'll bring 2 max to 1 and 2 minimum. This is going to be the one that scales up. And then we can just kind of expand it to say this many when it moves. So play with your color ramp to get the settings that you want it to do. Maybe I want it to be a little more subtle, something like that. Cool. So now the scaling is working. I'm going to rotate my instances a little bit more. And now what I want to do is when the proximity is working, it's scaling it up, but it's also rotating them a little bit. I don't want to touch him. I like where he's at, and I don't want to have to get into the weeds of setting that once we plug in the proximity. So I'll just go ahead and get another rotate instances node as the standalone node that is creating the rotation proximity. So all we need is to get a new map range node and then just plug these 3. The way to look at it is these guys don't change. I'll just highlight this for you. These guys don't change. Once they're set up, leave them alone. These map range nodes are the ones that dial in the effect. And so if I plug distance into value and plug that into rotation, but I specifically want to edit the Y rotation. So I can't actively plug it in right here. So what I need to do is get a combine XYZ node that will allow me to do that. So I plug that into rotation, and I now have the Y, but it's exposed for me. So I can just plug the result right into the Y. So now we can play around with these guys until we like them. Bring our from max to say something like 2. And that didn't work. So let's see. Looks like my from minimum plays with it. And let's see. There we go. So the 2 min is going to be controlling that. So I want to bring them. You can see how that's working here. The 2 minimum is editing the ones that are isolated by playing with the 2 max, from max. So just kind of say, how many do we want to flatten? The rotation is going to be a much more subtle effect. See how they're intersecting? I'm not like super mad at that because it won't really be noticeable up here. All I want is a few of them to rotate, and then how many of them are affected. So just massage around this effect. Okay, so I think we got it. If I play around with this, yeah, okay. we now have our effect. We now have these guys being affected. The last effect that we want is the color to be affected. And the portions that are moving, I want them to be orange, or I mean any color you want them to be. So we need to get a store named attribute to be able to handle that. So remember, if we want the ability to have information in geometry nodes being able to speak to shading and create an effect, there are a certain amount of things that can allow that to happen. Because we know that there is an effect being created that is sort of confined to this area, that's a little bit of context for us to go, oh yeah, that can probably create some interesting color effects. So it can. Let's go ahead and do that. So we need to get a store named attribute. And if you'll remember how we used it, pretty much in this course, we're just going to be using it to create color effects, but this can be used for many things. I would encourage you to look into it more as you get farther into your geometry nodes learning journey. So let's plug him here. All he needs to do is be in the area past the creation of the instances. If he's like right here, he's not going to be able to recognize there's instances. So being aware of the hierarchy, what information is flowing through what, he just needs to be able to recognize that there are instances, and then the data we plug into the value will give the context of, oh, this is the color that we're creating. So float is good, but go from point to instance because we do want to be affecting the instances specifically. And then I'll just call this A. Really arbitrary name, doesn't matter. And then remember how the color amps are the ones dialing in the proximity effect? Each of these are very unique to their effect, right? He is specifically dialing in the rotation. He is specifically dialing in the scale. And so we want another one to specifically dial in how the color is going to behave, how wide or how singular this color effect is going to be looking. So we'll get another map range, and we'll plug distance into value, and then plug this into the value. This represents the information that is going to be flowing into the color that is creating the effect. So if we're using a random value and we just want the instances, all of them to have their own random value to them, value in this case being shades of black and white, then we would plug the random value into here. Or if we're just playing with a selection and we have one object selected by using the index node, well, we would plug that information into the value. So that's what he is for. He's just the name of it. I've not really delved into the selection node, the selection spot, so it's whatever. He specifically, what are we affecting? Are we affecting the points? Are we affecting the faces? Sometimes we want to play with the faces. We'll choose that. We are specifically playing with instances. And so we will plug the result into the value. Now that we have that, we need to add a material to this whole node tree. That is going to be a set material node. Once we plug him here, we need to go over here and just create a new material. I'm just going to call him material. He's the only one in the world. So we can just select him. We don't need to name it, but you can if you want. I get if you like to do that. There we go. We have him. What we can do is now head to shading to make sure that this works. Remember, your attribute name is A, and we are looking at instances. That's important information. So let's head into the shading. And I'm gonna hit the period key just to kind of center this out. I want to be able to see effects happening in this area right here. So we're going to get an attribute node, type in A, and make sure that we're using the instancer because we're recognizing the instances. Plug factor into base color, and you won't really see anything super obvious going on. We need to go back into geometry nodes, use the material preview, and we need to massage our map range to give us our effects. So right here on from minimum, that is going to, let's see, get those colors working. From minimum is going to do it, also from maximum, but really it's the from minimum that's going to create these effects. So bring it to however many
you want it to affect. So something like this. Cool. So massage the from max until you like what it's doing. I'm going to click on my empty here. Go to my constraints to make sure that I like how this behaves. Super cool. All right. Now let's go back into shading. Like I mentioned, this is a Geometry Nodes course. This is not a motion graphics course. So I am assuming a little bit of knowledge about shading. We are going to be doing just some really basic materials. So I'm going to go here to the camera icon and switch over to cycles. I'm going to view through cycles. And if you hit this drop down, you get your own little default HDRI. So I want to view this because I'm going to be rendering in cycles. So I'm going to be editing the materials in cycles. So we're going to use this attribute node as a mask. So let's go ahead, Shift A, and search a mix shader. We're going to get 2 shaders, and I'm going to plug factor into the factor. So what we can do now is I'm going to select one of them. Looks like this one to be orange. I'm going to zoom in, and I want him to be a little shiny. And on the subsurface, we can just click and drag and make it 1. If you've never really delved into this, this is optimized subsurface settings for skin. Bring them all to a value of 1. It's just like regular subsurface. Then I'm going to bring my scale. Oh, bring your weight up. And then you can bring your scale up, and we can get some nice subsurface. Okay, so now that that's there, maybe make it a little brighter. And then, sweet. Our color is now set up. All right, so let's go back to layout and let's animate this really quickly. So here on the empty, let's go to the constraints and just give it an offset of 0. When it comes to the follow path constraint, a value of 1 is a full rotation. So I'm going to give myself 240 frames. I'm going to go hit the back arrow. And when it comes to making loops in your preferences, just make sure in the animation tab, your default interpolation is linear. All right, so now we could take this guy. I'm going to hit the keyframe, go to the very end and type in 100. That is going to be a 360 loop. There we go. Now it's moving. We got to do the same thing with our sphere. So click on him. He's already at a value of 0. And then we'll just give him 100. Sweet. This should be animating properly. Look at that. It's kind of slow. If you want to speed it up, we could do like 120. And then just bring your keyframes back to 120. So click on the empty. There we go. That's kind of more what I like. And then just on the icosphere, I would make him just an emission material and just make it brighter. All right, we're done. We're pretty much done. This is the scene. Let's just go ahead, give him a nice little background. Make it far enough to where the light's not going to really affect it. And then let's give it a light. Give it a nice little area light. Bring it up here. Switch that over to a disk. And then let's go ahead and make it brighter. And the world brightness can be a little bit higher as well. All right, let's get a camera, Control-Alt-0, snap that to view. And we're done. This is our final animation. We are done. This is how we create this really cool scene. It does what it does. It is what it is. And we're ready to finish. So go ahead and save this project file. Do whatever you want with it. So that is that practical lesson. Some really cool stuff there. Most important takeaways that I wanted you to have for this is different ways to use proximity affecting different things. In this case, the proximity is affecting the rotation, the scale, and the color. So those are really great things to walk away with, as well as arraying things in a circle. In this case, you had to use the align rotation to vector in order to get that to be aligned properly. So all of those things are things that are problems that nodes solve, and it's just something that you're going to have to remember in the process of using geometry nodes. So with that being said, let's get on to the next one.